Good evening, Bill.
Good evening, Sandy. It's been 2 weeks. I've missed you.
Well, that's very nice. I've missed you too.
That was my fault last week, so I apologize. But here we are talking about the facts. This sounds like a big one. This is a big subject, big topic.
Yes, and um, I'm not sure what will unfold, of course, as usual. The title is quite broad, obviously. In what context we could be talking about facts, nobody knows. And you did actually have a look at some other work I'd been doing that flashed up on the screen before we began. And the question that flashed up was, what is a fact? And you kind of balked at that. And so, of course, now I'm going to ask you, what is a fact, Bill?
This is like, it's like you're a biology teacher asking me to define life. What is a fact?
I'm just an art teacher asking you to define some facts. That's all.
You're an art teacher asking me to define art. That's what you're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
A fact. I don't know. A piece of knowledge that is undisputed. Most likely arrived at by personal observation.
Okay.
I dropped the ball hit the ground. The ball hit the ground, that is a fact.
But can you think of a fact that is not disputed or disputable?
Well, I can do that, but you can always bring irrational people into the question,
Okay, opinion tells us whether someone is rational or not, though.
Well, the earth is a globe. There are people who would differ on that despite preponderance of evidence. You can't argue with people like that someone has facts on their side and somebody really doesn't. So I mean, you get into those kinds of questions, right?
But you're using the word fact there, but you're still not yet really giving me a fact that's undisputed.
We are here talking right now at this moment in the present. There's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
Can you dispute that?
Probably could.
Yeah, you could, but I think a lot of the world is full of contrarians, right? So that's where you get into trouble.
But are you a contrarian?
I don't think I am.
No, exactly.
But everyone else is wrong. No, I'm just kidding.
Einstein said, truth is what...
Would you think I'm a contrarian?
Experience. Oh, I'm listening to you talking and I think about how categoric you can so often be.
Sure.
And I wonder in that when the rest of the world is wrong and when you've lined everything else up into nice little boxes, whether there's actually something quite contrary in that.
The funny thing is, I've been thinking about this in the 2 weeks that we haven't spoken. And, I think it was either the last time or the time before, where we got on the, me putting things in boxes and you not liking boxes thing. And it's interesting. It's like, I don't like categorizing things. I feel like I need to categorize things because otherwise the world is just a big cloud and there's nothing to grab onto,
But through that organization, are you seeking to somehow live by truth?
I think so. It's sort of an Aristotelian kind of point of view, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, listen, any fact can be debated. I think some facts are stronger than others. So, I try to build foundations on things that I think can hold the weight, as it were.
I mean, I wonder about whether we can communicate facts at all. whether we can communicate them. So whether we can convey a fact or receive a fact as communicated by somebody else. I wonder if that can actually happen.
With 100% accuracy or at all? Because you're a school teacher, so part of your job is to communicate fact, right?
No, I think that's a bit of a misdirection there.
Okay.
Again, I come back to this sense of, I've said a lot of times about this particular thing that really struck me when I heard it, and it was Elif Shafak speaking in the laboratory of, Library of Exile with the Potter. I can't remember his name, Edmund Duval, and they were speaking amongst themselves about being exiled for some reason or another from the places from which they'd come. And for some reason, they started talking about education. And Elif Shafak said something along the lines of, in school and education, we're kind of obsessed with information. And we're not actually teaching what it means to be knowledgeable. We're teaching what it means to have. And further still, we're not teaching wisdom, because wisdom is found within,
through experience,
and it can be modeled, but it can never be copied.
True.
This is paraphrasing completely now, but essentially we are using information as teachers, and so oftentimes I find myself not teaching to information, taking the information that I have encountered in my life and through my study, and yes, relaying it, but also, I guess, kind of qualifying that with a sense that it's only information, and that as such, there's a limitation to it. And instead, more, I guess, attempting to model wisdom is too conceited. It's not that, but it's modeling ways of seeing that don't have to be rooted in the information of what is seen.
Sure. I mean, I think that people really need to learn how to think. And I think facts are the scaffolding and rebar by which ideas are constructed.
Yeah, and I think
they're not worth much unto themselves,
There's a big problem in any kind of educational so-called setting where there's a total dependency on fact.
Sure.
Without actually the deeper sense of what is.
Well, I think because, I mean, I don't know if you guys in the UK have this, but standardized testing is a big thing in schools, say in America. And a lot of it becomes fact-based because thinking-based is far more complicated to know whether or not somebody understands something,
Yeah, and I often say, I can tell you what to think.
Yeah.
But it would be better for me to show you why to think, how to think, not what to think.
Yep.
And there's been a confusion there, I think, for a lot of educators, but also actually from a lot of students' perspectives about what is expected of a teacher.
Sure.
To be like an oracle, fine, yes, of course, there's a wealth of experience, and as I said, our own study. But really, I question this idea of just relaying fact, because what is a fact?
Do you have a good answer to that question that you asked me in the beginning?
No, I'm looking at it, and I think that when I question it, I wonder, can I ever express fact?
Well, I mean, I even think about some of the times.
Bill, hang on, sorry. Yeah. Please give some space to that. Can I express a fact?
You personally, or can anyone?
No, anyone.
Okay, well then, if you can't express a fact, you're getting down to the fundamentals of whether communication means anything, and obviously means something because you and I are communicating. You know, I may not get 100% of what you have in your brain, but that might be a failure of your words or vocabulary or the way you're structuring a sentence more than it is a problem with the inability to communicate, period. I think there are mediums that are better at communicating facts than others. I think words are better than communicating facts than paintings are, you know.
Well, of course,
because there's a lot more ambiguity in certain forms of you know,
well, there's
communication.
There's ambiguity. There's an ambiguity that we actually notice, but there's also a much more insidious version of ambiguity.
Sure.
That we don't notice.
Well, I mean, you could also look at people would say a photograph is a perfect representation, but somebody will say, well, what about 5 seconds before that photograph was taken and 5 seconds after? Maybe something completely different was happening in that same place, and truth is temporal, which of course it is.
But likewise, if we were thinking about portraits, for example, and I mean, I wish I'd actually put a Holbein portrait in here for us to look at, but I could say Holbein painted a wide variety of Tudor celebrities.
Sure.
And I could say, right, well, here's a painting of Thomas More. Not here, this is Dead Christ in the Tomb. More on that in a minute. But let's say we were looking at that particular painting, and I would say, right, well, if photography had been around in the early 16th century, perhaps we would have taken a photograph of Thomas More and we could have put it next to the painting of Thomas More by Hans Holbein the Younger. And
right.
We could have said, is one more a fact than the other? But further to that, we could then also have got Thomas More in. We could have sat him in a chair and we could have said, that's Thomas More.
Yeah.
And we could have questioned, of course, what is the more real, the most real? We could question whether any of them are the fact. And indeed, again, come back to this idea of what is a fact anyway?
I mean, in that case, I would probably say that the real person sitting in the room was the fact of the three.
But do we even question that?
You could question that. Whether or not it's worth questioning that is another whole other thing.
Well, I think
at a certain point, you have to have faith in something. Otherwise, okay, is reality exist? Well, of course, I don't know. Maybe it doesn't. In which case, then none of the things that we're saying or the concept of facts even matter. So,
in which case, you actually are linking into Holbein anyway. Sola fide.
Yeah.
You know that phrase in Latin?
No.
Sola fide, in faith alone.
Yeah.
You know, that really is where I think fact lies. And isn't that a curious thing that when we reduce it back to that, we see that fact isn't actually based on what we perceive fact to be, but is actually rather based in faith.
Yes, but not the way that completely evidenced faith is created. You're using a word in multiple ways, right?
I am.
Yeah, so you're cheating a little bit, right? No. You know. I mean, it is interesting, right? You have a painting here from 1521 of something that supposedly happened in, 30 AD. And obviously, this man was not there, but made a fairly realistic, representation of a dead Christ over 15 centuries beforehand. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of fact here. He knows what a dead person looks like. He's read what the Bible says about where Jesus was hurt, and then can paint a painting of a man lying there with those wounds. That really doesn't have any representation of fact, right? It's a factual representation of a written account that was written down 150 years after the death of the guy.
Well, okay, so I mean, Holbein was. Do you know much about Holbein?
Less than you, but more than nothing.
Okay, so
Go ahead.
He really courted the favor of a lot of the big names of the Tudor period, and more than that, people within the kind of at the cutting edge, I guess, of what would become a kind of Reformation throughout Europe. He painted people who were his patrons, who were kind of hungry for the status that could be found in a Holbein painting. He was very well known. And he painted people like Erasmus. In fact, actually, when you type in a name like Erasmus as his image, it's the Holbein painting of him, because Holbein was considered to be actually a realist. And he has a very particular purchase on kind of like a clarity of form that in so many ways is at once loaded up with symbolism, which arguably might take away a sense of fact, but likewise was renowned and is written about as capturing such strong lightness. And again, an error on my part, not really to put an example of one of his portraits in here, but this is a portrait in another way, just that the sitter would not have actually been Christ. And again, that plays with the idea of what can be a fact. The reason why I bring up people like Erasmus and then Sir Thomas More, for example, is that Holbein lived between different European countries, but he came to England, settled in England. He left his wife and his children in Basel, I think, and came over and I mean, eventually really had to move away from people like Thomas More because of his alliance in the court of Henry VIII. He befriended the Boleyn family, very powerful family. He became close to Cromwell. He was really a bit of a mover and shaker amongst very important people.
Isn't it funny, artists, though, that same thing could be said of every artist since then? Is that like ultimately, if they want to be known, they have to be known by movers and shakers.
Yeah. But this is a curious painting. And especially when we're thinking or talking about fact, as you point out, you know, the death of Christ would have occurred 15 centuries before this was painted. And yet this particular image is at the time was very subversive because it was so real. And also that's in part because of even the shape of the canvas. You know, it's the depth of a coffin or the height of a coffin. It is as if we're in that sliver space contained within the space of the tomb itself. And I mean, you can read widely about the sort of the mythology almost that's built up around this painting in terms of why he painted it, so that we feel like we are in that almost claustrophobic space of the compressed area of the coffin. What that does to us as a viewer, what that did to people in the 16th century who were used to seeing images of dead Christ, of course, but where those images would have been, I guess some people might say, more respectful to the to the nature of Christ.
Right.
And we did look at a painting, a sculpture, the Michelangelo marble, the other week. Do you remember? And Christ is completely nude in a very virile, lifelike way. And that was also not too different in terms of time, actually. But
it is funny that in this time period, well, for a long time, but definitely in this time period, there was both the strength of the church's belief, and in this case, you know, I guess the Anglican Church, but like that, you know, Jesus is man, but at the same time represent him as man, and like, oh my God, you made him look like a man. It's like he himself said he was a man. You said he was a man, like he was a man and a God. You know, it's like all this kind of stuff. It's really.
I think this is about the place of image in our understanding or appreciation of reverence.
Sure, right, but like, what does reverence mean, right? I mean, like a number of different people can interpret reverence in a number of different ways, right?
And indeed, we come back to the main question, which is, what is fact?
Right. It's what the powerful people say it is. at any particular time. I mean, even like, obviously the model that he used for this version of Christ is a very Northern European looking man and not a very Middle Eastern looking man. Whether Christ would have looked anything like this, who knows, so I mean, there are.
See, though, what we might say is that actually a body in a tomb, freshly dead, would possibly look very like this: blackened feet.
Sure.
The particular sense of skin, the
bruising and stuff.
Yeah.
Sure.
So
sure.
This is very death-like, lifelike, death-like.
Oh yeah, it's very accurate anatomically. Sure.
Mm. So when we're dealing with facts, especially when we're consuming visual art, we might think perhaps, or I might think or question whether there's like a sliding door of truth in painting, where truth is intersecting with other things all the time. And I wonder if at that intersecting point where something that is not truthful or not real, not a fact, collides with something that is fact-based, and that in itself gives it credence or nullifies it, that there is no truth in any painting, there is no truth in any photograph, there's no truth in any image.
Sure, you could go that far.
Well, what do you think?
I mean, of course, technically, yeah, that's true. Everything's a copy of a representation of a whatever. Sure,
Oh, yes, that's true. That's false.
But at the same time, I think you can really kind of go off the metaphysical deep end and throw out the baby with the bathwater, as it were.
Oh, I do like going off the metaphysical deep end.
What I would say though is that I think we also need to take into the account the fact that, in 1521, they didn't have video or audio recordings or photography or any of the things that would be one step closer perhaps today in the modern age to what we would say of some sort of visual representation of truth. So this is the best they could do at the time, right? Like this was magic that somebody could paint this and interpret it this way in such a lifelike way.
Look at it, interpret. As soon as we interpret anything, we move it away from fact.
But we interpret everything all the time. You even interpret facts that people tell you. Right. So yes, in your initial thing, does a fact exist? I guess not. But if it doesn't exist, then nothing exists, in which case we're right back to where we started,
I don't know if we are. I think it's also foolish to close it down and limit it. So there's not a defensiveness in this, Bill.
Yeah.
I'm just looking at this very slowly. And I
understand.
I would kind of like you to slow down a bit as well, because I think we could rush at this, and though the slowness of it is counter to the way you maybe are, the slowness might yield something that's actually interesting or useful in some way. For scrap useful, just interesting. What of this sliding door of truth?
What do we gain from seeing all fact and understanding as malleable? Like in a world where that is true, does that improve anything? Does it improve understanding? Does it improve communication? Does it improve, you know what I'm saying? Like, is there an advantage?
I don't. Well, isn't that curious? That you're making this positional.
Well, I think that
your words there, you're looking for an advantage in why we might question this. In a response we could come up with to the question such as, what is a fact, or can a fact exist?
Sure.
To say, is there value in asking the question? what is my advantage from finding out the answer? I don't think we need to have a categoric answer. We just need to look.
No, I think that certainly Western thought is built upon the fact that facts exists, right? Mostly because without that, I don't know what there is if not facts, right? Like throw that out, and then what actually are we talking about? Because even ideas are facts to some extent, right? Processes are facts. So in the end, you're gonna go back there and get back on the horse and drive down the road.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that there's nothing to say about questioning facts. It's that anything you say ultimately is kind of irrelevant when you put facts back in the equation, which you're going to have to do to continue talking about anything. You know what I mean? Am I not making any sense?
You make sense. I think this is a really interesting thing.
Can I argue against some of the ways that he writes this or says this?
I mean, I'm sure you will. But just before you do, just read it through.
Yep.
The idea of fear is much stronger than the fact itself. The idea of death is extraordinarily more poignant, more vital than the fact itself. Observe it in yourself. So we are never in contact with the actual fear itself. Just observe that. You cannot remove the idea. You cannot say, I'll try to meet fear without the word. But if you understand that you are never directly in communion with the fact of fear, with the fact of jealousy, with the fact of death, but only with ideation or memory, you will see a different relationship taking place between the fact and yourself.
Okay. And what I would do is do a search and replace, and every time he says fact, change it to the word experience, and it makes more sense. Because there's no fact of fear. There's the experience of fear. The idea of fear is much stronger than the experience itself. Yes. The idea of death is extraordinarily more poignant, more vital than the experience of death itself. Yes, I agree with that. But you're taking the word fact and acting as if some experience, like, I don't understand the use of the word fact in this way. You see what I'm saying? I think he's being sneaky about the way he's manipulating the words.
I'll have to say that I don't think we need to agree nor disagree with what's being said.
Yeah, I do agree with it though. Like my concept of fear is much scarier than the reality of fear. True, absolutely true.
Oh, hang on, you're now using the word reality.
Yeah.
Rather than experience.
As in the experience, yes, just because the experience of fear, sure.
But
yeah,
reality, the fact. So the word
is reality fact?
Well, you're using the word.
Yes, I just used it because experience is vague.
So does fact have clarity?
I think fact in the way he's using it, fact has a pointedness to it, as it has definite coordinates. but that doesn't mean that but I don't think that means anything. Like, okay, take the first sentence. The idea of fear is much stronger than the fact itself, as he says it. What, the fact of fear? What does that mean? What is the fact of fear? Fear doesn't mean anything unless somebody is experiencing it. But it's a little bit like FDR, right? Where it's, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. It's like, well, that's true. Because, me getting my tooth drilled is actually far less terrible than it seems like it if I have a dental phobia. The actual experience of that reality is not what my mind can conjure up. And I think that is, interestingly enough, all of these tend to be negative things, right? It's fear, it's death, it's jealousy. But I think the same exact thing is also true of all positive things. I don't think love really is what we make it up to be in our heads.
And again, but I do see that we could use any of those words. And as you suggest, we could put love there. But I also see that you're putting an automatic position onto positive, negative, or indeed using positive and negative values for things.
Okay. All of the values in this quote are all jealousy, fear, and death are all, I would say, pretty negative things as a general rule. But I mean, I get your point. I don't disagree with the statement. I think he's being sneaky about the term fact.
I think this is why we have to go very carefully.
Okay.
So in communication, when we lazily communicate, we misuse words frequently.
Yeah.
In that we might think that we get the ballpark word correct based on an intention of what we want the word to be or to mean, and based and rooted on our understanding of language. Yet so often the words we use are misleading. The images we create are more misleading still.
Sometimes consciously so.
I wonder if, rather than using the word consciously or thinking about this in terms of being conscious, that we look, if we can, at the things that are complacent. We are complacent about our language and about how we use or take in images. And when we're not, as you use the word conscious, and in that context, I would say when we're actually unconscious of what's happening, if we really look at it and we're present in our use of word or our depiction of things, I still come back to, again, even if we look at language there, our use of words. So we choose, so there's an intention in our depiction. We choose, we have an intention to make an image. So I wonder if anytime we actually have an intention for anything, we totally negate fact. If we intend to use information to qualify something, for example, we muddy the water with ourselves.
I think we can twist and try to drag facts to be, we can mutate things for our purposes, intentionally or not. But I tend to think that there is a stake somewhere in the ground that is sort of the Platonic ideal of that fact, and what people do with it or how they represent it or how they communicate it is always going to be some sort of perversion of that initial fact. Even describing it with language is going to sully it, as it were.
And this is why we come back to this idea of, I mean, you said, oh, well, you're a school teacher, you have to be okay with fact. No, I'm not okay with facts.
Well, I just said that you must use facts in your teaching. I mean, that's a lot of what people do, right?
I think everything I do always comes with a huge disclaimer.
Sure. I also think that it's interesting, even when you and I talk about this stuff, though, you know, and a lot of times you'll bring up art. Like I don't know this artist and I've never seen this painting. But and the fact of this artist and this painting existing and where they made it and what they called it and when it was made, all of those things are useful contextual clues to what we can use to discuss it.
Yeah.
But there's plenty of times when you and I are looking at things we don't know anything about, but can have a conversation about it because we have some understanding of processes and context of the history of all of this stuff, right?
But also in our dialogue, I don't think we're ever passing off what we say as a fact.
No, but that's because everything we do is kind of opinion based, right? Is there a difference between fact and opinion?
Well, yes, there we go. Here's another really interesting thing. How many people do you know who think their opinion is fact?
Well, too many people in the political world, certainly, right?
Again, there's this massive reliance on faith and fact, when in fact, I come back to this thing where you said I was being tricksy with my words. Facts are often based on the faith of what we hope it might be.
Sure. Or what we hope that it means, or what we think that it means.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, this painting is Jenny Saville. She's
what does it say? Is it backwards written? I can't quite tell.
It's a kind of, it's an excerpt actually. It's a French feminist text.
Got it. Sorry, go ahead.
And it's deliberately distorted.
Okay.
Because propped is meant to present the figure as looking in a mirror.
Oh, I see. Got it.
So the words are backwards, and also they are illegible, really. This was a painting from Saville's grad show. So she was a graduate of Glasgow School of Art, which is a highly prestigious art college. She grew up in Cambridge. She travelled to Scotland to do her degree. She was there from 88 to 92. And at her grad show, Saatchi bought her entire show.
See, it's the person plucked from obscurity that we've discussed over and over again.
Yeah, so really she was. I mean, it catapulted her, you know, to a kind of contemporary art fame. She was, I guess, in one way initiated via Saatchi into the YBA, the Young British Artist. And also this painting was in the Sensation show, which was a hugely controversial Royal Academy of Art show that was from the collection of Saatchi. It included the image of Myra Hindley made up of all the children's handprints. It included work by other YBA artists who are equally as loved and notorious. But this is a very large painting. It again plays, I suppose, with conventions. Saville's work is always centered on female nude, and especially her early work. This one included is self-portraiture. And there's a sense that one could be kind of participatory in this. When this was shown originally, when you turned away from the painting, you were faced with a mirror.
Neat.
So there was a kind of purposefulness to your presence within this reflection. It's very clever, and it's not enough to simply see it and say, oh, it's a female nude, or it's a large lady painted, or what's that writing, you know, but all together the kind of extraordinary nature of painting that speaks its own kind of truth. That's something I really am interested in, is in place of fact, we might yet have truth.
Well, then, yeah, truth and fact. Yeah, but the problem with that is that truth is subjective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Your truth and my truth have nothing to do with each other necessarily.
Right.
So,
I mean, I know I'm going to get really criticized for this probably, but is fact not subjective? We would say that the nature of fact is that it's not subjective. It's a fact.
That is the idea. That is the reason why we call it a fact and not an opinion. Yes.
Yes, I know, but then look at that. We're even talking here. You've just said, oh, well, the idea about facts is.
Right.
The idea about fact is that
yes.
fact is this thing.
The whole point of it existing is that it's not something that can be argued.
Yet, what is that? We're back to it again. But anyway, thinking about what truth is, like a revelation, but we could cite countless bits of art that are revelatory in some way, or that somehow bring up what an individual may perceive to be a truth about themselves or about the world, or themselves within the context of the world. And I wonder what the difference really is between a truth and a fact.
Listen, are there moments moments in books you've read or dreams you've had that feel more real to you than things you've actually experienced while you were awake? You know, I mean, I'd be willing to bet that that's probably true of everybody, right? I think the problem ultimately is the weakness of human perception, right? We are flawed pattern recognition machines that only have the sort of facilities that we do in order to not be eaten and find a way to eat and reproduce. So asking those machines to then analyze the world and explain the concept of ultimate truth, we're always going to be doing it bounced between 27 reflected mirrors at what the reality of truth is. Because we only have 5 senses, because we only have a certain amount of intelligence, because we only see in the visible spectrum of light, however you want to like look at it. It's always going to be a flawed thing, right? I mean, and if you want to take it that way, then yeah, sure. Mm. All of it's always an illusion. It's always, I think that there are things that are facts that are maybe the basic thing about a fact is that it's something 2 people can agree on and understand what the other one is talking about, right? Like, you know, that there's
look at the danger in that.
Danger in describing it that way?
Danger in 2 people agreeing. And that makes
it's terrifying. I mean, this show would explode.
No, but look, really, very seriously, that 2 people agree, and they believe that in agreement and accordance, they make a fact.
No, what I mean is that there can be something that they can both experience and say, yes, that thing exists. Not that their agreement creates the fact. It's a fact is something that 2 people can both experience and agree exists.
No, but also if we think about this in terms of experience, and we consider or imagine or reflect on a situation where I and another person have gone, oh yeah, that happened to me. And it's as if that's something that is totally ephemeral, becomes solidified into the realm of fact.
And anecdote becomes fact.
I just want to read something Saville said about her work. So I said, you know, lots of work of her own body, corporeal reality that's brought forth that challenges notions of beauty, for example, all the usual tropes we could go through about this. It's a challenge to a patriarchal society and the male gaze.
Sure.
It subverts the male gaze and upends notions of males painting female nudes, all that stuff. I think
Sure.
we probably don't need to talk about that much, because that's been talked about forever, about this painting and paintings like this. However, she did write or say, the more I do it, painting, the more the space between abstraction and figuration becomes interesting. So here is a human looking at her own human form, specifically female form, and giving us a very, what appears to be raw, clear, truthful image.
How do you know that?
Indeed, how do I know that?
You said appears to be.
Appears. I also use the word image.
Yep.
And I think here is the lot of all artists, is that we are creating images. And so what is the truth in that? Now, I had a conversation, funnily enough, it was with Sam Jackson, the painter, about this yesterday. Where gosh, Sam, I hope it's okay to say this, but I observed him coming up upon the idea or notion of truth in his own painting. Not because that notion is new to him, but because in context of what we were talking about, which was really this, I suppose, there was a sense of the truth never being available, that it can never be available.
But in the same way that perfection isn't, but it's what you strive for, whether or not you actually reach it.
But also there's the whole conversation around, again, we're already kind of having it, where if we recognize that there are no facts, or that our fact, what we think of as facts, are actually just sullied bits of information, that by not making things that are necessarily representational or copied or direct, that we do in fact arrive at truth through the very nature of our process.
I don't think we ever arrive. I think we strive.
Strive, yeah.
I photographed a man on Monday for a magazine who has HIV and cancer, and he's got tumors in his head and his sinuses, and he had to get one of his eyes removed in order to survive for another few months, but he's in hospice and he's probably going to pass away very soon. And tomorrow I'm photographing a guy who's 98 years old and survived Auschwitz. Both of those people I guess part of my problem with discussing the existence of fact is that those two people have facts that I would never feel comfortable denying. You know what I mean? Like the reality of impending death, the experiences that someone went through in a Nazi concentration camp. Yeah, sure. You could say, but did you experience those things? Did those things happen? What is it? What was that? Did that camp exist? Well, yes, of course, some things are sort of, I think both of those people would I sometimes feel like I'm being navel gazy discussing stuff that feels indulgent in the fact that I get to question whether facts exist because facts are not pointing guns at me and stopping me from living my life. Does that make sense?
But wait a moment. Again,
Yeah.
this is anecdote, but there is evidence to suggest that, for example, people who were incarcerated and lined
Mhm.
up for death in camps such as Auschwitz,
Mhm.
there's evidence that there was still, I guess, you're calling it navel gazing. Maybe it's Man's Search for Meaning. I mean, actually, Viktor Frankl wrote that book, Man's Search for Meaning,
Sure.
his time in the death camp.
Sure.
You know, because we may.
But meaning is not incompatible with fact.
No.
In fact, in some ways, meaning and analysis requires fact.
But again, I want you, if you're going to use this language, to tell me what fact is. Have you just rolled your eyes at me, Bill?
Well, I rolled my eyes at you because it's like, you're basically asking me what to define is. It's just like, well, I'm sure there is some definition, but it's so foundational that by putting it into words, it makes it sound 10 times more complicated than what the actual concept is.
Also, what I love
Yeah.
when speaking to you is that you always want to solve everything.
Yeah, I do. Because, per that guy on Monday, I only have a certain amount of time on the earth. Mm-hmm. So, get busy living or get busy dying, right?
True for all of us.
True. But I mean, I think I think there are some people who, again, it's like I'm like this romantic nihilist or something, right? Like I'm this romantic cynic, like cynical romantic. Like I want things to be beautiful and complicated and have depth and dive into them and search through them and never find the bottom of them. But then I also realize that, there's an egg
when we do it.
Well, because ultimately I feel like I'm going to get lost in there, and it doesn't change the fact that the egg timer is clicking up on shore. And when that egg timer goes ding, you will
have died and spent hours of your life talking to Sandi Robertson about imponderable things.
It's true. It's true. But these are the reasons why that it comes from not a fear of death, but a fear of squandering my experience.
But that is the fear of death, isn't it, Bill?
Yeah, I guess so, ultimately. But I mean, I don't fear dying. I fear not having used the time I have living wisely, I feel like there's a slight distinction between those two.
I'm not sure there is.
Yeah, that's fine.
Wow.
This painting
totally what have we been doing?
Well, you know what, Jenny Saville's painting sold for 13 million pounds or something. This painting right here.
No, more than that. In fact, I think it was 30 million, 30.
Oh, did it go for more? Oh yeah, this was in 2018. It went for 12.4 million.
I mean, Sotheby's actually have some misinformation about this, because she's a Glasgow School of Art grad. They talked about her grad show being at Edinburgh, and I really want to write to Sotheby's and clear that up. Anyway, Saville's work is to me truthful in the way that is again, try not to split hairs about it in the last couple of minutes, but it is about a truth. It speaks the truth about femaleness, maybe, but of course that depends on one's perception.
Define femaleness.
Yeah. So then I can go along this line and I can say, well, it's a feminist statement. And then that depends very much on how I think of myself within the paradigm of what feminism is and indeed means to me as a woman or not.
And what feminism meant in 1992 versus 2022.
Indeed. And also, do you know something really brilliant? I watched Saville working with a photographer. Oh, I can't remember his name. Luckman? I can't remember, but he shot her on Polaroids. He had a perspex platform that she got up upon and basically rolled around on nude. And he underneath took photographs of her squashy flesh, and then she made these paintings. They're really visceral, and I mean, she in part at least credits Picasso's strivance for weightiness in form in her paintings, but they're very challenging paintings as well. They do defy a convention whilst sticking to the conventions of traditional painting.
It's what is interesting to me, and I take a very like backup view of art and movements and ideas and thought, and I see it as this. She feels very much of her time. 50 years before she made this work, it would have been discounted because she was a woman, probably. 50 years from now, it'll look very old and dated view of, say, gender norms or femininity, probably, right? Like it's interesting how even what we think of as contemporary and modern thinking is only modern because it's now is when we're thinking it.
Well, I mean, this is something else she said, actually, relating to what you said. She was writing about her experiences informing her painting, and she wrote, "I grew up as a teenager in the 80s when body regulation became huge. We had a cultural obsession with the body." So she acknowledges that she's in direct response to a very particular slice of gender history.
Sure. It's also interesting, though. I mean, I bet you nowadays people would say, yes, and look, she's a white woman talking about femininity, right? Like, because there was very much of the time in the 90s when it was white women who were talking about that kind of stuff, right? It's fascinating. It's like just stepping back a little bit and looking at it all. It's just interesting. But again, it has as much to do with trying to find a discrete moment on a curve than it is trying to describe. The curve is more interesting to me than the discrete moment on the curve.
Bill?
Yes, Sandy.
When will we ever get to the bottom of anything?
Not with you and me around. That's what I have to say.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And that's a fact.